Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. This is a more in-depth tutorial about how to smooth and add texture into air dry clay. I always keep a little bit of water on hand and smooth out any textures or bumps or folds that might happen at the time of transferring my clay onto my cast. And you can see here it's very easy with just your finger and a little bit of water to smooth out some of those areas. Even if some of those areas are mistakes that you've made, you can go through and use your finger and get some of that to lay down flat. As long as you're not mashing very hard into the clay itself, it will smooth out, and using your finger gives you an opportunity to feel how smooth the texture is actually becoming. Now I do this before I trim any of the outer edges of my mask here. And you can see that I just continue to move my finger around and get areas smooth. This is even after I've scored in the part of this mask that's going to have even more texture. Now going in with some plastic, I tend to use the plastic that has a slider. It's easier to deal with, it cuts, and it saves you some grief. I'm using an off-brand and it's inexpensive, but it does help. And the tools that I'm using are tools that you do not have to have in order to make texture and go over a big area. I lay down plastic over the portion that I'm wanting to add texture, and I start off slow, as you can see here with this toothbrush. Now at this point, if you need something that's a little bit more blunt, you can go in with a couple of toothpicks that are taped together and cover more area. But for this look, I needed a base to build from, so I'm using this toothbrush. And also with a toothbrush, you can still cut some of the bristles to make the texture even different than what it is as you see here. Now I had two purposes for this mask, one for the actual special effects makeup and costume, and the other is that I can actually hang this on the wall. But you can absolutely use air foam clay for this, but you will have to work a lot faster. It will dry faster. So I like to take my time when I'm doing bigger projects, and I am using the air dry clay for this one. And as long as I can continue to see through the plastic, I go through with several different tools and make marks a little bit deeper. Just make sure that I don't press my tool to puncture the actual plastic or to puncture through the entire clay itself. Now before I begin adding texture and after I get my mask onto my cast, you do not have to use a cast for this. You can use an old mask, you can use a mannequin head, because this is not form fitting to the features of the face. You notice here in this Silent Hill nurse mask that we're taking away a lot of the human features of the face. The only thing that we've kept into this look is the overall shape of the face and the eyes. But when I start to do this, sometimes you have some clay that's a little bit heavier in areas, and it will begin to fall and drape and have a little bit of cracking to it. And if that happens, I make what I call slip, and that is taking clay, adding a little bit of water to it that you can actually use with a brush as in paint to cover up cracks and creases. And as you can see here up in the nose area, I had a crack coming around toward the nose, and I take my slip and I paint over to cover that up, because at this point I don't want to use my finger to smooth out and add too much pressure to that area. With the back of a brush, I go in and make that score a little bit deeper into the design. This is where I'm going to place the other pieces of clay to start to build up height. With each pass of plastic and my tool, I make my indentions just a little bit deeper than the ones before. It's just going to add to the overall look and not make it just one-dimensional. It also helps collect when you're painting. If you need areas that are darker and that holds more paint, those indentions will hold it, make it darker itself. It also saves you from having to constantly paint an area to make it darker. That's one thing I like about starting slow on my textures when I add to clay and then building that up. You could make other textures if you were to take small pieces of clay and carve into those textures and let that dry, and then use that to stamp over into the plastic to cover even a larger surface area. Going through with another pass through the plastic, you can see that I'm pressing a bit harder into this clay, and you can see the details start to come up to the surface a little bit more, but you also have that smaller layer up underneath. Now, in order for your clay not to dry, it will dry on the edges a lot faster, and if you want to work with those edges a little bit more, making sure that your edges are not too thin because they will crack, I go through with a damp paper towel and I cover the areas because you have air that's coming into the edges around the top and around the sides. So in order to have this entire piece dry at the same time, I start to cover those edges with a damp paper towel. Now, working with more clay, you see that I have an area over off to the side that has clay, and I work as I go. I do not pre-make these because they will dry out, and I want it all to dry evenly so nothing breaks or cracks. And I go through and I lay these pieces into the clay that I have on the mask, and I cover the clay I'm not using with plastic. And I do recommend that you work as you go for this portion. And when I go through, and if you do have clay that's drying a little bit, and say you made a piece like this and you could tell that it is not as damp as the other pieces or the way you would like to manipulate it, go through and add a little bit of water and smooth that out, as you see I do here in this portion. And I'm just taking my finger and making sure that those small little pieces are a little bit more smooth and it matches the rest of the mask. Now on the outside of these pieces, to make it look like it was part of the mask so there's not a seam or a separation, I go in with my finger and begin to press the outer half of this with a spatula to start, to get that into, and pressed it pretty hard to get it into the design in the clay that I have. And then I go in with my finger and I smooth that out for a better seam and transition. You can also dip your spatula into water in order to get that to blend in. You don't absolutely have to use your finger or slip, but I like to use a little bit of both. I like to feel the textures I'm putting in. I like to feel how it is smoothing out, and I also like to make sure that I have the areas that are lifted and the areas that are smooth. So I just continue to go around the outer seam of these clay pieces that I placed into this mask, and I continue just to smooth that on the outside and make sure that I have something that's seamless, because at the bottom of this mask it goes from gradual to higher depth and dimension. To get rid of the indentation that you see the pieces on the inside of this clay piece, I go in with this slip, which is a watered down version of clay, and I go through and I make sure that I cover up what I call the indentions, or the space between. It's just very gradual that there is a space after you lay a piece of clay down, but in order to get it to be smooth and look like it's part of the mask itself, that it's coming up to the surface, I go through with that and make sure that I just brush a little bit of slip into it and it covers up that actual seam on the inside. Going in with the back of my brush, I just go through and make more indentions that are a little bit bigger than the other tools that I was using, just for added dimension. The drying time on a mask like this, because it is on a cast so it doesn't get air up underneath it, it will dry a bit slower, but I was able to use a plastic bag and cover this because I needed to work on it for the next day or two to continue to add texture and more pieces into that area over the eye. But if you do want your clay to dry evenly, you need to put a plastic bag up over it. And so I appreciate you guys being here. I hope this gives you a little bit more confidence about working with air dry clay. It's very fun. Tag me in your looks if you're going to be using this. I would love to see what you guys come up with. And if you'd like to see sneak peeks, behind the scenes footage, or vote on my next look, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter. Those links are below. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.